if we don't prepare for war, again, not to initiate war, not to provoke war, but if we don't prepare for it, well, in the past, what's happened is it has cost us an enormous amount of humanity and resources. China's been practicing ship-launched strikes, and in the video that they provided to the world and put out publicly, the ship-based strikes, coastal-based strikes, interior Japan, interior China, long-distance missiles, and from their now militarized islands as well. Let's take a look at this. Arirang News Center, just the other day. Go.
Since the high-profile meeting between the U.S. and Taiwan, there's increasing Chinese military presence around Taiwan, having practiced ship-launched strikes involving an aircraft carrier. The U.S. responded by sailing a warship in the South China Sea. Our Poonji has more.
Footage released by China's military on Monday shows a fighter jet taking off from an aircraft carrier as the country carries out its third day of military exercises around Taiwan. China's state media said Monday that fighter jets carrying live ammunition conducted simulated strikes near Taiwan, and that its Shandong aircraft carrier was involved in the exercise. Taiwan's defense ministry also said it spotted 11 Chinese warships and 59 aircraft around the island as of 10 a.m. on Monday. China has been conducting exercises around Taiwan since last Saturday in response to Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's meeting with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in Washington last week. Announcing the three-day drill last week, the Chinese military had said the exercises serve as a, quote, stern warning to the self-ruled island's government. In response, the U.S. Navy's guided missile destroyer sailed near a man-made island, which is one of the Chinese-controlled islands in the South China Sea. The U.S. 7th Fleet announced Monday that its guided missile destroyer, USS Milius, carried out a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea to uphold the rights, freedoms, and lawful uses of the sea. It said the operations were carried out within 12 nautical miles of Mischief Reef, once a reef submerged at high tide and where China has built an airstrip and other facilities. The 7th Fleet added that under international law, features that are submerged at high tide in their naturally formed state are not entitled to a territorial sea, and stressed that Monday's operations demonstrated that vessels can lawfully exercise high seas freedoms in these areas. Noting that unlawful and sweeping maritime claims in the South China Sea pose a serious threat to the freedom of the seas, it said their operations demonstrate the U.S. will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows.
And China doesn't recognize international law as applies to the South China Sea. You can see the mentality. Xi has studied what took place in World War II. He studied the Japanese, Tojo. He studied Hitler. He studied Italy, Stalin. He studied all this. And internally, he's using their practices. And externally, he has looked at their war techniques. And others around him have as well. So they signed these agreements that they have no intention of complying with, like with Hong Kong. Hong Kong was supposed to be free for another half century, so he devours it. You can see the same thing with Putin. Ukraine was supposed to be free, period, after they surrendered their nukes in 1994. Putin invades it. And you can see what's going on with Taiwan. It's really quite troublesome. And then we have this French President Macron, as I mentioned before. He meets with China's Xi, and he sells out America. And here's Sky News Australia, which covered it the other day. Go.
Emmanuel Macron has had a meeting with the Chinese president, of which he thinks that they should work a little closer together, cuddles and all. This, remember, was the bloke who was angry because we decided to no longer build the submarines that France was making because we wanted to be able to sidle up closer to the Americans and the US. And in actual fact, American nuclear subs are currently in Perth as we speak. Now, I remember weeks and weeks and weeks of conversation about how annoyed the French were. Seems like the former government and the current government made exactly the right decision, James, which was to get away from the French.
And I remember doing some of the reporting around that back at the time that all of that broke. But, I don't think anybody who knows a scintilla of history here, Paul, should be one bit surprised by this behavior by Macron, because, this sort of French diplomatic perfidy goes back literally for centuries. People will remember the 1980s when Reagan couldn't fly bombers over France to bomb Gaddafi. They'll remember what a hard time de Gaulle had dealing with Churchill, and Churchill had dealing with de Gaulle, how France didn't want to be in NATO. All of this. This goes back to Louis XIV, when the French signed a memorandum of not doing anything to stop the Ottomans from invading Vienna, because, according to Louis XIV, when the Holy Roman Empire said, hey, we need your help, no, crusading's not fashionable anymore. So this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. This goes back hundreds of years, and we should always make our diplomatic plans accordingly, Paul.
Well, interestingly, one of the quotes here, and I think we can back these up from Macron, says, the question Europeans need to answer, is it in our interest to accelerate on Taiwan? No. The worst thing that would be think the Europeans must become followers on this subject and take their cue from the US agenda and Chinese overreaction. Europeans cannot resolve the crisis in Ukraine. How can we credibly say in Taiwan, watch out, if you do something wrong, then we will be there? Now, what is he quite admitting about the failures, about what's happening right now in the Ukraine? But, Matt, this is an interesting little attempt here, and I noticed that the Herald, in one of its editorials, is saying this bloke kind of, is the ultimate shapeshifter, and while his own capital city is burning because he wants people to retire 2 years later, he sort of shapeshifts into sort of part position that Xi wants, which is basically Taiwan is for China to worry about, not Europe, US, and places like Australia.
Yeah, well, James is right there. He's trumped me with the history. I was going to go with that, although not all the way back to Louis XIV. But I do in all the reporting here, I am perplexed that there doesn't seem to be any comments from Emmanuel Macron about China's position on Ukraine, and in particular, China's continuing support and seemingly friendship with the Russian government, with Vladimir Putin in particular. Maybe Macron is not that worried about Taiwan, although I think the international implications of anything that happens there will affect France too. But he should be, of course, very worried about what's happening in his own backyard in Europe. And one of the reasons that continues to happen is because the likes of Vladimir Putin has seemingly the unending, unconditional support of the Chinese president. And so it's very disappointing to see Macron, who apparently was so strident towards the Australian government and our perfidy to rip up a nuclear submarine contract, but can't seem to have the same strength of approach to a government that is actually supporting the invasion of another European country.
The sub-issue was very simple. The French were making a deal with the Australians for subs. The French were building diesel-generated subs. We competed with the French. We suggested that they buy ours instead, which were nuclear-generated subs, not nuclear subs, missiles, nuclear-generated subs. And the Australians went with us, multi-billion-dollar deal. And France was very upset about that. Who cares? You compete, and they lost. But all that said, my attitude now is screw France. The hell with France. Don't buy anything from France. Not that we do. Don't buy their wine. There's plenty of wine that we produce here in the United States. Australia produces wine. Israel produces great wine. Spain, Portugal, you can name. But don't buy any French stuff.
For all this and much more, sign up for Levin TV.